glimpse into what I think is going to be the future of leadership. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by leadership and why I think it's undergoing so much change. For those of you who may not know who I am, just a very brief intro. I know probably most of you do know. But my name's Kevin Wheeler. I'm one of the directors of this conference. I also wear a couple of other hats. I run a consultancy in the U.S. called Global Learning Resources. We do a lot of work with large and smaller organizations on their talent strategies. And the focus is really on recruitment and on employee development, leadership development. That's what we work in. And I also run a think tank called the Future of Talent Institute. And in the Institute, we try to look out 3 to 5 years into the trends that are having or will have an impact on people and work. So we look at like the future of work and what's work going to look like in 3 to 5 years from now. What are some of the big trends that are going on around employment, around how people work, around how people learn, how we're using and leveraging technology for learning. And we also look at what's going on in leadership. And I think this is one of the more interesting areas today because it's the one that's in the most flux or change, although it's probably not visible to you very much yet. But if you begin to look at some of the organizations that I'm going to talk about, I think you'll begin to see the patterns that will become a lot more familiar to you over the next 3 years. So remember, we're talking about what's about to be, not what is. And a lot of people say, oh, I'm not really seeing this. And I don't expect you probably are yet, unless you're in very unusual organizations, but you will be. And this is really about if you're in the development role or have a development role, or if you're in recruiting and you recruit leaders, we're going to be looking for very different people and training them in very different ways. So how many of you here are involved in training of leaders or leadership development training of some sort? Okay. And how many of you recruit people who are going to fit management or leadership roles? So virtually everybody has some involvement in this process of leadership. So let me just start out by making a proposition to you. That traditional leadership development, what's it designed to do? What is the goal that you have when you train somebody to be a leader? And you probably don't think about it in those terms, but every time you bring somebody into a training program or into a training class, you're training them to do something. So what is it we're training them to do? The first goal is to produce people who are able to make decisions when things are reasonably predictable. Right? Think about that for a minute. And if you look at your businesses, you look at the organizations you're in, generally speaking, you, me, anyone in this room can probably make a pretty good educated guess about what tomorrow's going to look like, right? You agree? Yes? No? Yes? 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 Yeah, most of us. So, in a 20th century world, if you made cars, you're pretty sure if you made cars this week, they're going to be making cars in pretty much the same way next week, next month, next year, and 3 years from now. So you train people to make decisions in a very narrow and fairly constricted set of circumstances. Predictable solutions. The second thing we do is we teach you how to control information through rewards. And if I ask somebody, why do we have leaders? Why do we have managers? What would most of you say? And if you told me to tell people what to do or whatever, I say, yeah, that's all true. What you're really doing is giving people the power to control other people. In lack of perfect communication systems, in a world without good communication tools, which we didn't have for most of the 20th century, the only real way to communicate information reliably is to have people that you can implicitly trust to do what you tell them to do. And they pass those orders down to you, and if you don't do what they tell you to do or want you to do, you don't get rewarded. So they control you through rewards to do what they want to do. There was an old story about the British Empire, and it's a very true one. And they said, why does Oxford and Sandhurst exist? And they said, Sandhurst and Oxford were perfectly designed to produce colonial leaders who could go to any of the colonies and without any communication tools, remember how you couldn't pick the phone up and call India or call Australia, took months and months to get any kind of information here. So how did Queen Victoria know that what she wanted to have done in Australia was actually happening? By basically training people in a very rigid series of schools, Eton, Oxford, Sandhurst, very rigid, weeding out everybody who was any deviation from the rule. And so she knew anybody who got selected to go to Australia or India was completely and totally obedient and would do exactly what the British Empire wanted done. That's what it's for. So let's just face reality. That's what leadership training is all about. We're not quite that draconian, but that's fundamentally what we're still doing in organizations. I want to make darn sure, if I'm the CEO, that if you work for me, you're going to do what I want, and if you don't do it, I'll fire you or take away your rewards, and I expect you to do the same all the way down the organization. So that's what we do. Third one is what I just talked about. You'll do what I expect you to do within the boundaries that have been established by the corporation or the organization. So I'm training you this. Leadership developments are I'm training you to do this. And we coach it in all kinds of different words. We couch it in all sorts of ways. Around good communication skills, feedback skills, reward, performance management. We call it all this stuff. But the fundamental thing is do what I tell you to do and make sure everybody else does. And that's what it's about. And then the last one is to take action and accept accountability all by yourself. Who's responsible if I don't do what I'm supposed to do? My boss, right? You're responsible. You take accountability for your actions. And we take great pride in that. I am accountable. The buck stops here. And we're proud of that. So that is a 20th century model. That is what leadership development has been all about. That's fundamentally, in a very simplistic way, what we do in leadership development. So if we look at it from this way, it's a serial process. One leader follows another leader, each one individually accountable for what they do. We don't really have any concept of group leadership. No such thing. Each one of us acts alone, and when I resign, someone will replace me. Succession planning, you might call it, okay, or whatever it is. Right? Only one leader. Can't have more than one leader. It's sort of a mantra. What am I going to do? You can't have two people telling me what to do. I'm going to have one person tell me what to do. So it's one person kind of leadership. It's make the decisions and follow. We've already talked about that. And the big thing, it's emotionless. We're proud. We take great pride in taking all emotion out of our leadership decisions. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to make you all redundant. I don't want to do that, but it's a business decision. No emotion involved. Right? You're fired, you're hired. It's an emotionless process. It's neutral. You agree with me? I'm sure some of you don't, but we can talk later. We can have the conversation. Okay? So that's pretty much the standard model. That's what I strive to, varying degrees of success in that, but that's kind of what we strive to. So it's perfectly suited to a manufacturing world. It's perfectly suited to a world of very low complexity and pretty clear understanding of what you're doing and what's going on. Okay? When I can pretty much figure out the solution, if it's a technical problem, if it requires expertise or knowledge, I can figure that out. Not a big deal. Okay? Works when turnover's low. Works when things are predictable. It's a nice model. It worked really well for about 100 years. But it's under tremendous stress today. Very ineffective in a very complex, very global, very interdependent world where I can't know enough to tell everybody what to do. There's no CEO smart enough. They just released, Booz Allen just released their latest study of CEO succession. Now, they've been studying for 37 years CEOs and what happens to them. How long are they in their job? How long are they a CEO? How quickly do they leave their job? How soon are they fired from their job? And for the last 10 years, it's gone down, 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 down. Average CEO tenure right now is less than 3 years. Less than 3 years. Why is that the case? They're not able to produce the profits. They're not able to deal with the issues. Because the world is no longer simple and clear-cut and straightforward. It doesn't work anymore. All of these CEOs are struggling. I don't know if you talk to your CEO. Talk to any senior leader. They're struggling. They don't get it. What's going on out there? This world is not the world I grew up in. This isn't the world I learned about in MBA school. This isn't the world where my Excel spreadsheets give me the answer. It doesn't work anymore. I'm lost. I'm confused as a leader. And we see it every day in everything we do. Just take a look at a case study. Look at the BP oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? Now, this is a colossal, complex problem. Humongous problem. How would you like to be the head of BP? Anybody here want that job today? I mean, imagining any leader at BP. These are just some of the interdependencies that you're going to be working with. You've got to deal with governments, with technical people, with senators, with wildlife officials, with Coast Guard people. Sorry. Thank you. Aha. Now you can probably hear me. Huh? Okay. You could hear me before, huh? You're in the front. So look at all these people. This is just a small sampling of who you have to deal with, all right? And you're dealing with these people at a variety of levels, and sometimes they're all sitting in the same room, and you've got to talk to them. You've got to make them all happy. You've got to tell them what you're doing, convince the public, the world. You've got the media, you've got television, you've got the press in front of you. And this is even if you're a fairly low-level leader. If you're just one of the technical leaders on one of these ships out there trying to scoop up oil, you're dealing with every single one of these people. Where did you learn about that in MBA school? Okay. Where did you get the training for that? If any of your classes that you teach cover this stuff, you say pass this off to PR. Well, PR doesn't do this stuff anymore, okay? PR is not on these ships out there with a helicopter from CNN swooping down saying, why aren't you fixing the leak? So it's a whole different world that you're part of. Right? How do you stop this bloody leak? We're trying to figure this out. Which expert do we call in? Right now I see it's almost hilarious to me to watch what's going on. The U.S. government's screaming louder and louder. The Louisiana government's screaming louder and louder. BP's working harder and harder, and they still can't stop the leak. It's not about yelling and screaming. It's not about force. It's not about coercion. It's about being creative. It's figuring out how to solve this bloody thing. And in the end, I'll bet you the ultimate solution of this thing is going to come from a bunch of people that theoretically don't know anything about how to stop leaks, who are probably the roustabouts or the guys that spring wrenches on these things that are going to come up with some sort of a creative solution. I'll guarantee you the solution, this will be crowdsourced. It'll be broad-based. It's not going to come from any single individual. It's going to be a very complex and creative process to fix this leak. All right? And complexity. Look at the complexity of this thing. You're drilling a mile down under the ocean. Nobody's ever done this before. They've never stopped a leak this deep. They haven't got a clue how to do this. And this is just like day in the life of BP. And how many other oil wells do they have? And how many other leaks that we're not even hearing about are they probably dealing with? And you're asking leadership to deal with this every day of their career, and we sit them in a classroom and give them, basically useless training for this kind of stuff. They don't need the stuff we teach them. All right? They need the stuff we're not teaching them. All right? Look at all these examples, and these are just some. Terrorism. Suddenly maybe they're going to blow up an airplane. You're the head of Qantas. Maybe you're just the gate agent at Qantas. Maybe you're just a leader of the cabin attendants at Qantas. How are you going to deal with terrorism? What are you going to do? How are you going to respond to this? How are you trained to do this? Are you trained? I don't mean trained in self-defense. I mean just trained. How do you think about this? How do you even deal with this? Where is fear rational and where is it irrational? How do you deal with this stuff? How do you deal with this in our daily life? Okay? Global financial crisis. How do you deal with that? How are you muddling through as a leader of your organization? If you're in a sector that's not affected that much by it, should I be worried or not? I don't know. Confusion. People don't know. The recession, what impact on sales? Google, great example. Here's a company. Its objective, like every company, is make money. They go to China, huge market. You know, I don't know, 40% of the world's people live in China. All right? You've got millions and millions of people, and the potential revenue is astronomical. And yet the Chinese government says, we're going to shut you down. We're going to censor your results. So what do? Do you leave? Do you stay? You know? Do you make a financial decision or an ethical decision? How many of these leaders, how many of you teach ethics? Okay. Yeah, 1, 2, okay, 2 or 3 of you. And yet, almost every business decision today requires some kind of an ethical solution. Virtually every decision is an ethical dilemma. What does BP do? What's ethical? You know, what's the right thing for BP to do? How do you respond to this? Okay? How do you respond to any of these things from an ethical perspective? So you're called on as a leader to start thinking about ethics and about creativity and about vague stuff that's unpredictable, that you have no clue how to deal with it, and yet we pretty much taught you that everything is solvable in an Excel spreadsheet, that if you're just a good financial manager, everything will be just fine. If you learn good basic communication skills, you'll be great. Create a vision, rah-rah the crowd, and fill in your spreadsheets, and you'll be a good leader. Doesn't work. Doesn't work, and we're seeing it every day in the turnover in leadership around the world. Okay? And in the ineffective leadership we're having. It's part of the symbols we're seeing in politics. We're seeing it everywhere. The old models of leadership are failing. Okay? Well, this is the new world. We don't live in a manufacturing world anymore. We're living in a world of knowledge, of information, of instant, vast, tremendous amounts of information. Vastly more than we can deal with. All right? We're living in a world that's complex. It requires long learning curves to really master things. We're living in a world where its processes are complex and multi-leveled. Requires tons of information and expertise that no one human being can possess. Not possible. Right? It's an external, global, interconnected world. Highly complex. Okay? And structures are moving to become very flat, very large, and very team-oriented. So when you look at that stuff, and then you look back at the curriculums that we're dealing with, the way we train people to be leaders, I think anybody can see that this is not the best way. We've got to have something's got to change. Not going to work. It's not working. So it's got to function in a highly complex world, multiple global diverse interactions, and very little certainty about anything. Okay? Very little certainty. Nothing can be counted on or predicted. Right? So the model that we're coming up with is it's got to be concurrent leadership. You cannot be a lone leader. Cannot do it. The concept of a CEO, I believe, is pretty ludicrous. We need lots of CEOs. Okay? We need lots of people in the boxes. Okay? We need all the brain power we can possibly get. And I don't know how many of you know this, but the Roman Empire for 400 years was ruled by 2 people in the box, 2 in a box. They had 2 leaders that coexisted. They both had to be in agreement, consensus, or nothing got done in the Roman Empire. Okay? We may be moving to something more like that. Maybe it's not 2, maybe it's 4 or 5. But it's a very different model. Okay? It's collective action. It's team-oriented. It's multiple people coming to consensus and agreement on this is the direction we need to go in. This is the way we have to move. It's creative. It's very different than what we've got. It's about sharing ideas, sharing your decisions, having real conversations, not saying, what do you think, Bob? Oh, I think this. Okay, yes, sir. Doesn't work that way. Okay? Doesn't work that way. And emotion is critical to this. You're going to have personalized decisions. You're going to have to take into account the ethical and personal impacts of what you're doing. We're seeing this every day when it comes to treating the environment, treating energy, treating our employees. Why doesn't Gen Y want to work for you? Because most organizations, this is what they want, and what they're getting is that flat, sterile other side of this equation. And they're not seeing this as part of the solution here at all. Okay? We're going to have to build emotion into leadership. You know, many of you have probably heard of EQ and all this stuff. A lot of people go, a bunch of crap, it's bunk. But EQ and emotional stuff is going to play a significant role as we move into the future. And management and leadership is going to be selected and trained for those who have these capabilities and skills, that have emotional intelligence, that can understand what's going on out there in the world and how their decisions are going to impact people, how people feel and are affected by these things, that they can understand and manage themselves, their own feelings, the feelings of others. They can build relationships. They have social awareness. They can work in groups and teams and interact with other people. These are going to be essential skills for leadership. But I'll bet you none of your leadership selection criteria cover much of this. We still select and we still train for yesterday. And the companies that are going to be very successful are the companies that are focused on this kind of a model. And if we begin to look at what's going on out there, and I'll just give you one little example, the U.S. Army in Afghanistan. Now here's, the U.S., we're trying. The British failed. The Russians failed. Pretty much everybody's failed in Afghanistan. All right? And now we're the guys there. And so, the military academy is one of the most forward-looking models of leadership there is. And I think it's pretty interesting that the organization you would expect to be last in changing is actually leading the way in what's going on here. And they're looking at what's going on in Afghanistan. Complex? Incredibly complex. You've got geography, you've got culture, you've got religion, you've got language, you've got history. It's incredibly complex. Why is the Taliban doing this? Why do people support the Taliban and not something else, okay? How do we build support, okay? The solutions in Afghanistan are not going to be military, right? The solutions in Afghanistan are going to be psychological and sociological and economic. And military is probably going to play a little part. So what the U.S. Army has done now is create these platoons of soldiers who are equipped with sociologists and psychologists, with people who speak the language, the local dialects, and understand the history. And they're given big, hairy goals like go reduce insurgency in this area. And that's it. That's the only plan and goal they have. And they say use whatever tools it takes. Let us know what you need. And we'll try to get it to you. But basically, we'd like you to be self-sufficient and figure out how to do it yourself. And they're having tremendous success in converting villages and changing people's minds around this war. Now, whether it will ultimately be successful or not, I don't know, but it's certainly a lot better than just shooting a bunch of people. Does this take emotion? Absolutely. Does this take, ability to influence people, ability to have empathy and understand it? Absolutely. How many of you have heard of Jeremy Rifkin? Anyone? Jeremy Rifkin has written a number of books, very brilliant guy, very hard to read. He's written The End of Work and so forth. He just wrote a new book called The Empathetic Organization. And his whole book is about the role of empathy in organizational future. And his belief is that we have to become a much more empathetic society, meaning being able to understand how other people feel and how our actions are going to influence them, and thereby change our course of direction based on that. This is a lot different than just imposing your will. This is about having a dialogue and a conversation with people and trying to understand how you feel and you understanding how I feel so that we can begin to move to some common place. So there's a lot of thinking and work going on in this, but we're very early in this whole process. We're very early in thinking about this. Okay? So vertical leadership may have a role if you're running a manufacturing plant. If you're running some 7-Eleven or something, this might work okay. It's not that it's a discredited model. It's just a less useful model. And it's certainly not a model that's going to be replicated and growing in large multinational corporations. when you heard Dr. Williamson this morning, for those of you who listened to it. The old leadership model doesn't fit in that world he's talking about. It requires a different kind of leader to be successful in that world. Right? A very different kind of leader. So, we need a broader conversation of leader, of who's a leader, of what's a leader. Okay? There's a new concept. There's several books that have just come out about leaderful organizations. It's a new word. You look in the dictionary, you won't find leaderful. But it's an organization where everyone thinks of themselves as a leader, where everybody assumes a role of joint accountability, of responsibility, of trying to work together toward a common end, and nobody sits around waiting for the boss to tell us what to do and worrying about getting fired by the boss, et cetera, which our whole life has pretty much been centered around. Okay? It's about that every role, in one way or another, has a leadership component, and that we're all going to have a different leadership role at different times. So if you look at Google, a lot of Google's work is done in project teams. And these project teams have no formal, permanent leadership structure. Yeah? You're a team, and you guys are doing Google Earth. And if we're in the coding phase, then you're the coding person. You're going to lead that phase. Once we get to marketing, then you're going to take over. Everybody has a different leadership role at a different phase in that project. This is just becoming normal. And so we all need leadership skills. It's not just about having this select group of hypos that have been pulled aside to get trained to be these wonderful financial leaders. It's all a bunch of bunk, right? And it's all going to go away. Right? So the new leaders have to look a lot more like this, and the old leaders were kind of like this. Okay? And if I look at a standard leadership curriculum, and I pull a bunch of them out and look at them, they're all oriented around this stuff. Every one of them I see virtually is around the stuff on the left. How to set goals, how to make plans, how to write budgets, how to communicate negative feedback, how to coach your employees, how to get them to do what you want them to do. Right? That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about, how do we get everybody together into a room and solve tough problems like oil spills? How do we come up with creative solutions to things? How do we make more money, guys? How do we go out and sell better? Look at a startup. How many of you work in a startup or small company? And I bet you practice more of the right-hand side than you do the left-hand side, right? Because you almost have to. You don't have the hierarchy. You don't have all that expertise. So you're forced to be on this side over here, and you all sit down and scratch your heads about how do we go forward and what do we do? And we know for a fact that group decision-making is far better than individual decision-making. Right? So leadership development's new focus has to be shifted quite a lot into what several people are calling, this isn't my invention, I'm actually not sure who came up with this, but it's a lot of articles written about the T-shaped person. And I don't think it's just leaders, I think we all have to be T-shaped. And the T-shape simply says, on one axis, you have technical expertise. Okay? But on the other axis, across the top, you have to have that emotional, collaborative, and communication skills. And if you don't combine the two, you're not going to be successful, probably as an employee, and certainly not as a leader. And actually, the depth of the T here is immaterial. You can have a very short shaft on this T, but you better have a pretty long crossbar at the top of that T. Right? And so we've almost flipped the 20th century around. I always call the 20th century was a century of building. It was a century of creating, making stuff. It was the maker's century. You can say the 19th and 18th were farmer centuries. The 20th was a builder's century. And now we're moving into a knowledge century, a very different place. We can make stuff. Automation will make stuff. We don't need so much of this technical expertise. We need a lot more of the stuff across the top of that. The technical expertise is often available on the internet or buried in various software tools or automated into equipment and machinery, or we can pool a bunch of technical experts together that will probably be in a university or somewhere where they can't do any damage. Okay? So, we've got to deal with ambiguity, all right? This is a world where there aren't any clear answers. Nothing's very clear. What's Australia going to look like in 10 years? Who knows, What's going to happen with the GFC and with resources and with China and So anybody got an answer here? Anybody know for sure? Anybody even able to predict remotely what's going to happen? I don't think so. Nobody knows. It's a world where you're going to have to act quickly, on your feet, constantly understanding and seeing what's going on, emotionally attuned to what's going on, and intellectually attuned. So how do you do this? You're going to have to develop skills in dealing with ambiguity. You're going to have to develop skills in creating simulations, scenario planning, leveraging social networks, solving problems in groups. That's what we need to be training our managers. This is the stuff that they need skills in. We need lots more courses and a lot more practice in doing this thing. We probably need to change how we structure a lot of our organizations and make them broader and more team-oriented, more interconnected, so that we can share and practice this stuff. We need to be putting them into things like, what if an oil well blows up? What are we going to do? What if China censors us? How are we going to respond? Okay? What if the resources market dries up? What's Australia going to do? How are you going to respond to that? Those are the stuff that's important. That's what's really critical. That's what's going to make a difference to your company and to this country, not all this other stuff that we've been spending the 20th century with. So the first thing is dealing with the ambiguity. The next thing is dealing with complexity. And you cannot, I just keep underlining, no one of us can deal with the complexity that exists out there today. So to expect that the sole expert, the lonely guy at the top, is going to sit there and make that big decision, it's not going to happen. It's very scary. I don't want him to make that big decision. I want a whole bunch of people up there with a lot of brain power making that decision. And I want that decision to be crowdsourced. I want it to be leveraged. I want a whole lot of people working on this. Procter & Gamble about 7 or 8 years ago was doing very, very badly. They hadn't had any new products in like 10 years. The last new product that Procter & Gamble had was babies' nappies, disposable. And those have been out for, a few years, And they were recruiting all these MBAs, hiring all these sharp young people in. And if they didn't have a few major blockbuster products, they might have gone out of business. So the new CEO came in and he said, this is ridiculous. He said, I'm going to let our customers design and invent our next products. So they opened up this huge website that you and I, all of us can go in there. Everybody can say, we want this, we want that. Here's a great idea. How about this? They created this entire forum, and they required all their designers and all their product developers to participate in this online forum and discussion room. Profits have soared. They've come out with like 7 blockbuster products. All came from the crowd. They all came from you and me telling them what we wanted, rather than some expert sitting back there doing his focus groups and market research saying, this is what you want, because it wasn't what you wanted. Eli Lilly, huge manufacturer of drugs, has gone out with a site asking people to help them solve problems. So they have these huge technical chemical problems, like we don't know how to, I can't even understand what the problem is. But they've got these huge complex problems that are laboratory scientific problems. They put it on the web. You can go in there. Anybody who contributes to the solution gets paid. They've solved like a dozen major, huge issues that they hadn't been able to solve for 10 years by just opening up to the whole world and saying, help us to solve these problems. So it works. We know it works. There's lots of examples that this works, okay? And it's not about owning your IP. It's not about holding on to stuff. It's about letting go of stuff. It's about opening up, spreading out, and letting everybody share in what you're doing. A very different place. It's the only way to deal with complexity. I'll bet you if BP put a website out saying, how do we solve this oil leak, that they would probably, in a matter of hours, have 100 great solutions that nobody's thought of at BP yet. But no, we respond by screaming and yelling and escalating the political war instead of in a real meaningful way that might actually solve the problem. Our tools aren't working. The way we do things doesn't work. Okay? And the last thing is these interdependencies that are everywhere. None of us are an island. Okay? And I think the old poem that no man stands alone, never been truer today. You absolutely are totally connected to everybody and everything in the world. And if a leaf rustles in England, it's felt here. All right? And you have to be able to understand and deal with the interdependencies about this. You cannot say, it's Australia only. No such thing. It's how does Australia interact with all the other interdependencies in the world. And that requires intelligence, emotion, thoughtfulness, awareness, all sorts of skills that we don't really teach our leaders or any leadership people. It's about how do you build relationships, alliances, partnerships. How do you negotiate? How do you give and take? How do you do all this stuff? And we're very bad at this in the Western world. Much better in Asia. Much better in Asia. Asia already has a head start over us because a lot of these things we're talking about are built into the cultures of Asia. In our cultures, they're not. We were the maker culture, and we really believed in this lone wolf out there doing everything. All right? And we've got to foster creativity. We just have to find things. There has to be a lot more diversity into everything we do. Diversity in thinking, diversity in ideas. You know, to only get your ideas from America, to only get your ideas from your own employees, to only get ideas from is a self-defeating proposition. Open the doors and get ideas from everybody everywhere that you possibly can, no matter how weird, no matter how diverse and different they are. Explore, experiment, fail, but as they say at Google, fail, but fail fast. And pick up yourself and move on to the next thing. Don't take a long time to fail. All right? Try it. It doesn't work. Go on and try something else. Okay? But it's a world where we don't have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. And it's a world where we've got to experiment to figure out what's going on. I'll throw out some assumptions for you here, just to challenge you. If you want to know a little bit more of my thinking on this, I wrote a blog post about this a couple days ago that you can read. But, let's get rid of budgets. Budgets are just control tools. You know? Why don't I tell you I want you to go do something and you tell me how much it's going to cost to do it? You know, tell me what you need for resources. Why do I have to give you, but how the hell do I know how much you need? I don't even know what you're doing. But I'm saying you've got $1,000 to do this, and we all go back and scratch our head like, I can't do this for $1,000. So we do something sort of half-assed. Right? Instead of saying, this isn't going to work. What do you have a plan for? All plans do is limit. All they do is slow you down. Okay? If I say to you, reduce insurgency, isn't that a lot better than kill 4 people? Or what kind of a plan would you have? Some detail room, go to this village, shoot 2 people, go to this village, do that? I mean, what kind of a plan do you put together in an ambiguous world? You give people big, hairy goals. You put them together in a good group of people, a big crowdsource of people, and you let them go and do it. Okay? Why do you have a deadline? If anybody here ever significantly shortened a deadline, even if you did, you probably didn't tell anybody. You said, good, now I can kick back for 3 days. It's not due till Friday. Why would I do it early? If I do it really early, they're going to tell me something's wrong. You're basically calling whoever gave you the deadline an idiot because they didn't know how long it would take. You might want to finish a little early to show that you're very smart, but we're very, very careful how much we do that. But maybe you could do this thing in an hour, but you've got a week. Let's take the week. Why hurry? Right? Deadlines are ridiculous. And rules are mostly stupid. Listen to Woody Allen, yeah? Hey, whatever works. Within a certain set of ethical principles. So it's about changing. This is all 20th century stuff. And if you're building cars, it works. If you're fixing terrorism or oil leaks or whatever, it doesn't work anymore. I don't know how much it costs. I don't have any idea what the plan is. I don't even know what the right rule is. And so who's sitting around spending countless wasted hours making up this stuff? Get rid of them. And just go for it. And that's what I love about a company like Facebook or some of these little startups. They don't have any rules. Did you tell them something that, this is the law? Really? Yeah, I didn't know that. We haven't been doing that for 3 years. They don't care. They just go do what works. And all I say is you need some ethical principles around that, but go do what works. Okay? That's what it's all about. So the new focus is going to be on leveraging social networks, ideas, brainstorming, learning, maybe being mentored virtually and face-to-face, finding lots of people around the world to mentor you. I don't mean formal mentoring, like you are now my mentor. It's about, hey, I'm going to put a tweet out and say, Kevin, what do you think about this? And I may or may not answer. But hey, if you put out enough tweets, enough people will answer, and you'll get some great ideas. That's mentoring, okay? Find people that are knowledgeable in certain areas and go ask them stuff. That's why we've got the internet. That's why we've got Twitter. That's why we've got all these tools out there. Use them, and use them effectively to do that, okay? Development within context, what are you trying to do? What's our goal here? What is our rationale for existing? Why do you do whatever it is you do? And I think most companies are very unclear about the why. The beauty, I think, about a company like Apple is, why does Apple exist? Not to make computers, because they make iPods and a bunch of other stuff, So why does Apple exist? And, Steve Jobs, he said something very good. He said, we exist to make beautiful, perfect things. Okay? They can make chairs, tables. They just choose to focus on electronics. But we want to make beautiful, elegant, perfect things. And they do. Pretty much, they do. And that's a great why. And you know why you're coming to work every day. Not to make computers, but to make beautiful, perfect things. So we need better context about what we're in business for and what are we doing and why are we doing it. Okay? And we need all this other stuff that goes around it. We've got it all. We've got more stuff than we need to enable all of this leadership learning to take place. It's about harnessing it, integrating, and using it, not about developing any more of it. I kind of look at it this way. Leadership development model, kind of little model. Customer insight. You get that from websites. Procter & Gamble, the story I told you. Eli Lilly. What do customers need? What do you want to know? What kind of stuff do you need to know? What do you think? What do your customers think you need to have for leadership? What do people need? What do you think you need for leadership? And you get information from lots of sources. Collaborative points of view. How do other people think? What's the consensus view about what we need to do here? Okay? About what people need to learn. And then maybe how do we learn this? A lot of different routes to accomplishing that learning. It can be simulations, conversations, websites, maybe classroom, maybe learning on the job. Maybe 100 routes to doing this. Let people go their own routes. Okay? Viral leverage, Go out there and get feedback on this from people. Get commentary. Listen to what's going on, to what people are saying. A lot of this is in the EQ space, about listening, empathy, leveraging what people are saying, and then continue to have conversation and community and feed that back into this. Leadership development is not a sterile academic discipline that's 4 years long and ends in a degree. Leadership development is how you live. It's how you think. It's how you act. It's a collective process that we have to continue to build new skills to foster. And I think you're going to see a lot more collaborative and rotating leadership. And a lot of companies like IDEO, which is a design company in the U.S., they sort of have a Tim Brown kind of runs the company, sort of. But, even he doesn't kind of scratches his head and says, I don't know, I'm kind of the guy. But he sits on the floor with everybody else. You walk in there, you have no clue who the CEO is. You wouldn't have a slightest idea who's who. Everybody's kind of working all together. They collaborate, they share. People wander in and out of meetings. You have no idea who they are. They only have job titles because they're required by law. Inside the company, it's forbidden. You just have a role. So you're an engineer, you're a HR person. Even that's very informal. If you're an engineer and you want to get involved in HR stuff, fine, no problem. It's a totally open, collaborative, communicative system. And lots of people think they want to work there, and after a day they quit because they can't figure it out. Who am I? What am I? We tie so much to our title and our position and I'm a manager, I'm not a manager. It doesn't matter in a place like that. We're here to solve problems, to make great designed products. That's what we're here to do, and that's all that matters. Okay? So it's a very different concept of leadership. Okay? So a lot less focus in the classroom, a lot less focus on theory, a lot more, if you want to do theory, learning it after you know how you're doing something, and you can go back and look at why, if it's even important, or if it even lasts that long. Social networks, virtual stuff is critical. Okay? So, The Power Pull, new book just came out, highly recommended. I don't know if any of you know John Hagel or John Seeley Brown, but they're two really innovative thinkers in the talent space. They're both in California, and they've written a couple of books. This is their newest one. And, I'll let you read that. But I think this last section, the success of institutions, depend on their ability to amplify the efforts of individuals. That's what it's all about. How do I amplify you? That's what leadership is. How do I amplify all of us so that we're much better collectively than any of us are individually? That's what it's really about. That's the power of leadership. Okay? It's doing what you couldn't possibly do alone and helping people and fostering people to do that. So I'll let you look through that. I'm not going to read them all. The only one I will talk briefly about is this being culturally sensitive and competent. Once again, it goes back to that EQ, emotional side of stuff. We need to be vastly better at this than we are. And I would say if there's one glaring hole in leadership education, it's the emotional side of it. It's this kind of stuff. It's understanding diversity and cultural differences and being able to deal in a world that's not all rational, scientific, and can all be put on a spreadsheet. Here's some online resources that you might want to look at. I'm happy to make these available to any of you, and you can do that by sending me tweets or writing to me. If you want to read about that budget stuff, you can go to my blog there, thebyto.com. Go to any of my websites, send me an email. I'm happy to be a networker, a collaborator, a sharer. And if we get any questions, let's go for it.
Thanks. Kevin, Ray Hintz from BHP Billiton. Western culture has always been about having the standout individual, whether it's sporting teams or whether it's businesses, to lead it. What you're suggesting is, and you did mention about a company in America, do you see the day coming when the traditional organisational structures of big companies will change to the point where you have executive managers reporting directly to boards and there won't be a CEO?
I think that's very, very likely, very possible. I think what we're seeing, it's really a very interesting time. And like I'm saying, we're talking 3 to 5 years out here. But if you look at Gen Y, and I base a lot on what's coming in terms of the generations that are moving in, this is a generation that is already tribal in how it thinks about things. This is a generation that already works in teams and groups and consensus. If you go to a school, at least in the U.S., and I'm probably true here, we don't sit in rows anymore. They're sitting in tables like this. They're sharing and doing work together. Almost no one does individual work or assignments. In my university classes when I teach, if I told my students to do something on their own, I think they'd all faint. It's all group projects. It's write a paper together. It's collaborate. This is the way it works. And so if you see that as the generation coming up, you know that this focus on our focus on individual everything is going to change. Now, whether that means the CEO itself disappears or becomes different, I don't know. I don't have that much of a crystal ball. But I think we are definitely safe to say that it's going to look a lot different than it looks today. And there's going to be a lot fewer people who have the title, manager, director, whatever it is. Question?
Yeah,
okay.
Kevin, Ross Clinett. I don't disagree with anything you say, but back in the real world, where what you're talking about is very much in the minority inside organisations, what actually has to happen to get that shift occurring? Because I don't know about the US, but in Australia, people's leadership behaviours are going to be influenced firstly by the culture inside their organisation and secondly by MBA programs. So I'd be really interested in your perspective in, without a BP oil spill happening, how do we get those behaviours inside an organisation occurring?
Yeah, really, really good question. I don't know that I have a completely satisfactory answer for you, but I've got some ideas about what I have seen starting to work. I think number one is, I think we all, as a profession, have a responsibility to bring some of these ideas into our organization, even if they're not all accepted, or even if I don't expect anybody's going to say, yeah, okay, let's go for it. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think you can begin to introduce some of the concepts, some of the coursework, some of the ideas. I call it viral infection into your organization of some of these ideas and concepts. They're already happening in some ways through hiring young people, through hiring people from startup organizations that have had different experiences. So I don't really think that you're going to see a BHP or a Telstra or anything like that suddenly transform. Not going to happen. But I think what you are going to see is new organizations arise that are very different, that operate under very different principles. I think that we, if we're in those big companies, need to try to bring this thinking in. We need to try to influence it wherever we can. We need to try to tweak and change the curriculums in terms of leadership development to include some of the things that I mentioned up here. There's a lot of stuff we can do to begin to push the ball. But it's a 5-year process at least, if not longer. And it's nothing that's going to happen overnight. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. And what I'm really saying here is I just think this is sort of what I see as an inevitable way that we're going to go. I don't know for sure the time frame, but I know we are going to go in this direction. And so anything you can do to push the ball, anything you can do to influence it is good. I think what we're also seeing is sort of another way to look at this is that organizations are changing. And I talked yesterday in my workshop about how organizations, I think, are shrinking, and they're going to continue to. And I think I'll put it to you this way. If I see any big organization that's significantly growing, I'm very, very worried. I wouldn't invest in any company like that. I would certainly sell my shares immediately. All right? I think the way to go is small and to outsource and to spin off stuff that's not core and to have as small of an organization as you possibly can from a sustainability perspective and also from the ability to do what I talked about here, to collaborate and share. So if you look at small organizations, you look at organizations like Facebook or any of these, they're small and they're fairly focused around key players. And they're still, some of them I call confused or got one foot in one world, one foot in the other, but they're slowly figuring out that big is not beautiful, that small is beautiful, and that you can be much more creative and collaborative if you're small than when you're big. And if you need to have services done, spin them off and let somebody else do them. So there's a lot of stuff happening in parallel. Gen Y, shrinking organizations, smaller companies thinking and acting differently, slowly, hopefully, introducing some of this thinking into companies. If Eli Lilly and Procter & Gamble can begin to introduce this thinking, anybody can. I mean, they're old and very established companies and very hierarchical, and they're changing and adapting. And I talked to some of them, and they're struggling, a lot of the guys my age, certainly that don't like this world and don't understand it, but they don't really have any choice but to start to move along with it. So it's a complicated answer, and it's not a simple one.
Good afternoon. My name's Deborah. I work for Zurich Financial Services, so that's a very big global organisation. So we're facing this issue, and it's a very interesting topic because all the way through, the way you were talking, my answer was, oh, well, it just sounds like this is just paving the way for women to take over. And I think really... Paving the way for... women.
Yeah, you're absolutely
because
right.
Because we can do all that stuff that you were already...
I didn't put that in there, but I'll talk about that in a minute.
I know it's a little bit sexist, and, I apologise to all the men in the room, but we are taking over. But I would... I think that one of the ways that we are changing is because we haven't got any other solutions. So we are trying to find new ways to handle the problems that we've got that we face. But my question is, I'm surprised that you would say that CEOs have made the decisions alone, because I thought that good CEOs had always asked for feedback, and that's what a board was for.
Oh, I think good feedback, good CEOs say, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think, and then do exactly what they want. And that's what they're expected to do, And if a CEO, I think we would say in a very traditional company, if you said the CEO only did what he said, he'd be considered a very ineffectual CEO. Because you've got to have your own mind, you've got to be able to make your own decisions. It's a macho world up there, and I make the call, I'll make the shot. I'm sorry, good advice, but I'm not taking it. We're going to do this. And everybody else's responsibility is to say yes, sir, and go do it. So that's the way it works in a very traditional male-oriented company. To your point about women, very insightful comment. This absolutely is more of a feminine leadership model than it is a male leadership model. And we're clearly seeing a huge rapid influx of women into leadership. And already in organizations that they are a significant part of, we're moving more to this kind of thinking. Certainly the EQ side is playing a bigger part. I think Pepsi is a great example. A lady from India leads Pepsi. It's made some brilliant decisions recently. Very collaborative leadership team. She is very much a woman. And is responding in a very different way than a guy would in that same role. So we also know that 2/3 of all university graduates today are women, that more and more women are moving into formal education and getting new sets of skills. So it really is an age of women. And in fact, one of our Future of Talent predictions is we call it the age of women has dawned. And it will continue to grow, primarily because these are the skills that we absolutely need. And women have these skills for the most part.
All through your presentation, I was thinking of a really interesting example, and it kind of, to a certain extent, disagrees with the last two people that have spoken. If you look at the AFL, 16 sporting teams, of the AFL teams, 6 of them do not have a captain, they have co-captains. 14 out of the 16 have a leadership group rather than a hierarchy, and 15 out of 16 actually have player vote to elect those players. So that's all men, but all young men. And so that's clearly a generational change. But if you look at the ownership and the board of a football club, it is very much that old model. So because they're an organisation that has a group of people at one height, then a bit of a gap, and then the next one, you can really see that difference. And the people in the older group should be looking over their shoulder because that's the model that's coming at them.
Fantastic. I had no idea about that, but that's great. That's a great example. And it really, I think, underlines that generational thing that I talked about. These young kids are very different than me and how my generation thought about things. Vastly different. Very interesting.